Dad's new girlfriend moved in and he tried to control everything, so I snapped and told him in front of his friends. Part 1. The New Arrival. It all started when my dad introduced us to his new girlfriend, Karen. I was sitting in the living room, lost in the latest video game, when he called me into the kitchen. Dad looked nervous, which was rare for him. Karen stood by his side, smiling like she had just won the lottery. She was tall, with perfectly styled hair, and a wardrobe that screamed expensive taste. I remember thinking she looked more like someone who belonged on a reality TV show than in our modest home. "Dylan, this is Karen," Dad said, his voice tinged with a mix of excitement and uncertainty. "Karen, this is my son, Dylan." "Nice to meet you," I said, offering a handshake. Karen's grip was firm, and her smile widened, but there was something in her eyes that made me uneasy. "Nice to meet you too, Dylan. Your dad has told me so much about you," she replied, her voice smooth and sweet. I nodded, unsure of what to say. Dad and I had been doing fine on our own since Mom passed away 5 years ago. We had our routines, our traditions, and our way of handling things. The idea of someone new stepping into our lives felt strange and unwelcome, but I knew better than to voice my concerns just yet. Over the next few weeks, Karen became a regular presence in our house. She cooked dinner with Dad, joined us for movie nights, and even started suggesting changes to the decor. At first, I tried to be accommodating. After all, Dad deserved to be happy. But it soon became clear that Karen was not just looking to fit in VGJ, she was looking to take over. Part 2. The changes begin. Karen VJTM's influence began subtly. She started rearranging furniture, insisting it would make the space more functional. I came home one day to find my favorite armchair moved from the living room to the basement. "It does not fit the aesthetic," she explained with a smile. Then she began replacing our old family photos with new ones that included her. The first time I saw a picture of her and Dad on the mantle where Mom's photo used to be, my heart sank. "Dad, what happened to Mom VDJ Clem's picture?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Karen answered before he could. "I thought it would be nice to have some new memories displayed," she said, her tone casual, as if she had every right to make that decision. Dad glanced at me, his expression apologetic, but silent. It was clear he was trying to avoid conflict. He had always been like that, VDJ, more of a peacemaker than a fighter. I nodded, swallowing my frustration. It was just a picture, I told myself, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. Things escalated quickly from there. Karen began dictating how we spent our weekends, planning activities that she enjoyed without considering our traditions. Gone were the lazy Saturdays watching football with Dad or the spontaneous fishing trips. Instead, we were going to art galleries and brunch spots that felt more like Karen VDTM's world than ours. The final straw came when she suggested I should move out. "You are old enough to have your own place, Dylan," she said one evening over dinner. "It would be good for you to gain some independence." I stared at her, my fork frozen halfway to my mouth. "This is my home," I replied, trying to keep my voice even. Karen looked at Dad, as if expecting him to back her up. He avoided my gaze, focusing intently on his plate. "Karen has a point, son," he said quietly. "Maybe it is time you thought about getting your own place." I felt a surge of anger and betrayal. "And where am I supposed to go?" I asked, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "We can help you find a place," Karen said smoothly, as if she had already planned it all out. I pushed my chair back, unable to sit there any longer. "I need some air," I muttered, leaving the table and heading outside. I stood in the backyard, the cool night air doing little to calm my racing thoughts. How had things gone so wrong so quickly? And why was Dad letting it happen? Part 3. The Confrontation. As weeks turned into months, Karen VJTM's control over our household grew tighter. She had an opinion on everything, from what we ate to how we spent our evenings. The more she inserted herself into our lives, the more distant Dad seemed. He started working longer hours, coming home later and later. I wondered if he was avoiding the tension at home or if he genuinely did not see what was happening. One evening, I decided to invite my friends over for a barbecue. It was something we had done for years, a tradition that predated Karen VDJTSM's arrival. I wanted to reclaim a bit of normalcy, to remind myself and Dad of the life we had before she came along. Karen, however, had other plans. As soon as she heard about the barbecue, she insisted on organizing it herself. "I can make it more sophisticated," she said, her eyes lighting up at the prospect. "We will have gourmet burgers, artisanal sides, and a signature cocktail." I bit my tongue, not wanting to start another argument. But as the day of the barbecue approached, I grew more and more anxious. This was supposed to be my event, my time with my friends. I did not want it to turn into another one of Karen VDJTM's carefully curated experiences. The night of the barbecue, my friends arrived to find a scene straight out of a lifestyle magazine. Fairy lights were strung across the yard, a beautifully set table dominated the space, and Karen flitted around like a hostess at a high-end party. My friends exchanged looks, clearly uncomfortable with the change. As we sat down to eat, Karen took control of the conversation, steering it towards topics she was interested in. My friends tried to engage, but it was clear they felt out of place. I could feel the frustration building inside me, a pressure cooker ready to explode. Finally, I could not take it anymore. Karen made a comment about how much better the yard looked since she had redecorated it, and I snapped. "You know what, Karen? This is not your house," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "You have been here for a few months, and you act like you own the place. You have rearranged everything, thrown out our traditions, and now you are trying to push me out of my own home." The yard fell silent. My friends stared at me in shock, and Karen VDGJTM's face turned pale. Dad, who had been quiet up until now, looked like he wanted to sink into the ground. "That is not fair, Dylan," Karen said, her voice trembling. "I am just trying to make things better." "Better for who?" I shot back. "Because it is not better for me, and I do not think it is better for Dad either. You are manipulating him, and he is too blind to see it." "Dylan, that is enough," Dad said, finally finding his voice. But it was too late. The words were out, and the damage was done. Part 4. The Fallout. After my outburst, the barbecue quickly fell apart. My friends made their excuses and left, clearly uncomfortable with the tension. Karen retreated to the house, tears streaming down her face. Dad stood in the yard, looking torn between anger and disappointment. "Dylan, we need to talk," he said, his voice tight with emotion. I nodded, following him into the living room. We sat down, the silence between us heavy and oppressive. "Do you have any idea how hurtful that was?" Dad asked, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Dad, she is taking over our lives," I replied, my frustration bubbling over again. "She is changing everything, and you are just letting her. She is trying to make things better," he said, echoing Karen VDJTM's words. "We have both been through a lot, and she is bringing some much-needed positivity into our lives." "At what cost?" I asked, my voice rising. "She is pushing me out, Dad. She wants me to move out of my own home." Dad sighed, rubbing his temples. "Maybe it is time, Dylan. You are an adult now. It might be good for you to have your own space." I stared at him, feeling a mix of anger and betrayal. "This is my home too," I said quietly, "and I do not want to be pushed out just because she wants more control." Dad did not respond, and the silence stretched on. Finally, he stood up. "I need some time to think," he said, heading towards his bedroom. "We will talk more tomorrow." I watched him go, my heart heavy with frustration and sadness. I had hoped that confronting Karen would make things better, but instead, it felt like everything was falling apart. Part 5. The Silent Treatment. The next few days were a blur of awkward silences and tense interactions. Karen avoided me, spending most of her time in the guest room she had taken over. Dad and I barely spoke, and when we did, it was strained and uncomfortable. I tried to reach out to him, to explain how I felt, but every time I brought it up, he would shut me down. "I do not want to talk about this right now, Dylan," he would say, his voice tight with stress. "Let us just give it some time." But time only seemed to make things worse. Karen VDAHTM's presence loomed over everything, a constant reminder of the changes she had brought into our lives. I felt like a stranger in my own home, tiptoeing around to avoid another confrontation. One evening, I came home to find Karen packing her bags. She looked up as I entered the room, her eyes red from crying. "What is going on?" I asked, my heart racing. "I am leaving," she said quietly. "I cannot stay here and cause so much tension. It is clear that you do not want me here." I felt a pang of guilt, but also a sense of relief. Maybe things could go back to normal now. "Where will you go?" I asked. "I will stay with a friend for a while," she replied, her voice trembling. "But I need you to know that I care about your dad. I was not trying to take over. I just wanted to help." I nodded, unsure of what to say. Part of me wanted to believe her, but another part was still angry at how she had tried to change everything. After she left, the house felt strangely empty. Dad came home later that night, and I could tell something was wrong as soon as he walked through the door. "Karen left," he said, his voice flat. "I know," I replied. "She said she needed some space." Dad nodded, but he did not look at me. "I need some space too, Dylan," he said quietly. "I think it would be best if you found your own place." I stared at him, my heart sinking. "Dad, you do not mean that," I said, my voice shaking. "I do," he replied, finally meeting my gaze. "I love you, son, but we need some time apart. Maybe then we can figure things out." I felt a lump in my throat, but I nodded. "All right," I said quietly. "I will start looking for a place." As I headed to my room to start packing, I could not help but feel a sense of loss. My home, my family, everything I had known was changing, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Part 6. Starting over. Finding a new place was not easy. The rental market was competitive, and affordable options were scarce. I spent weeks searching, going from one disappointing viewing to another. Finally, I found a small apartment on the outskirts of town. It was not much, but it was mine. Moving out was bittersweet. As I packed up my things, I could not help but think of all the memories I was leaving behind. Every room in the house held a piece of my childhood, a piece of my life with Mom and Dad. It was hard to let go, but I knew I had to. Dad helped me move, but the tension between us was palpable. We exchanged few words, the silence filled with unspoken emotions. As we carried the last box into my new apartment, he finally broke the silence. "I am sorry it had to come to this, Dylan," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "Me too, Dad," I replied, trying to keep my emotions in check. "But maybe it is for the best. We both need some space to figure things out." He nodded, looking around the small apartment. "I hope you will be all right here." "I will be," I said, forcing a smile. "It is not much, but it is a start." We stood there for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened hanging between us. Finally, Dad patted me on the shoulder. "Take care of yourself, son," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You too, Dad," I replied, watching as he left. The door closed behind him, leaving me alone in my new place. I stood there for a while, taking it all in. This was my new reality, and I had to make the best of it. Part 7. Adjusting to change living on my own was a big adjustment. The apartment felt empty and quiet compared to the house I'd shared with Dad. I missed our routines, our conversations, and even the little arguments, but I also felt a sense of freedom. This was my space, and I could make it whatever I wanted. I threw myself into work, trying to distract myself from the loneliness. I took on extra shifts, volunteered for projects, and spent long hours at the office. My colleagues noticed the change, but I brushed off their concerns. "Just keeping busy," I would say with a forced smile. Despite my efforts, the evenings were the hardest. Coming home to an empty apartment was a stark reminder of everything I had lost. I would often sit on the small balcony, looking out at the city lights, and wonder how things had gone so wrong. One night, as I was scrolling through social media, I saw a post from one of my friends about a local community center. They were looking for volunteers to help with various programs, and I decided to give it a try. Maybe helping others would help me find some purpose again. Volunteering turned out to be a lifeline. I met new people, made friends, and found a sense of community. It was a welcome distraction from my own problems, and it gave me a reason to get out of bed in the morning. Slowly but surely, I started to feel like myself again. Part 8. A glimmer of hope. Months passed, and life started to settle into a new rhythm. I still missed Dad and our old life, but I was finding my way. The community center became my second home, and the people I met there became like a second family. One evening, as I was finishing up a volunteer shift, I got a call from Dad. I had not heard from him in weeks, and my heart skipped a beat when I saw his name on the screen. "Dad, hi," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey, Dylan," he replied, his voice sounding more tired than I remembered. "I was wondering if we could meet up and talk." "Of course," I said, my heart racing. "When and where?" "How about tomorrow at the park?" he suggested. "Around 5? "Sounds good," I agreed, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. The next day, I arrived at the park early, my mind racing with thoughts of what Dad might want to say. I spotted him sitting on a bench near the lake, and as I approached, he looked up and smiled. "Hey, son," he said, standing up to give me a hug. "Hey, Dad," I replied, hugging him back. It felt good to see him, to feel his familiar presence. We sat down on the bench, the silence between us comfortable but charged with unspoken emotions. "I'm sorry, Dylan," Dad said finally, his voice breaking the silence. "I'm sorry for everything that happened, for letting things get so out of control." I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. "I am sorry too, Dad. I did not mean to cause so much trouble. I felt like I was losing everything." "I know," he said, his eyes filled with regret. "I should have listened to you more. I should have been more supportive." We sat there for a while, talking about everything that had happened. It was not easy, but it was a start. We both knew it would take time to rebuild our relationship, but we were willing to try. Part 9. Rebuilding relationships. In the weeks that followed, Dad and I made an effort to reconnect. We started meeting up regularly, going for walks, grabbing coffee, and slowly rebuilding our relationship. It was not always easy, and there were still moments of tension, but we were both committed to making it work. Karen had moved back into her own place, and though she and Dad were still seeing each other, they were taking things slower. I could see that Dad was happier, and I was glad for him. I still had my reservations about Karen, but I knew I had to give them a chance. One evening, Dad invited me over for dinner. It felt strange to be back in the house, but it also felt good. As we sat down to eat, I could see the effort Dad had put into making things comfortable for me. Karen is coming over later, he said, his voice tentative. I hope that is okay. I nodded, taking a deep breath. It is fine, Dad. I want things to be better between us. When Karen arrived, she greeted me with a warm smile. Dylan, it is good to see you, she said, her tone sincere. Good to see you too, Karen, I replied, trying to keep my own tone friendly. As the evening went on, we talked and laughed, and I could see that Karen was making an effort too. She was less controlling, more willing to listen, and I could tell she genuinely cared about Dad. It was not easy to let go of my resentment, but I knew I had to try. Part 10, moving forward. Over time, things slowly started to improve. Dad and I continued to work on our relationship, and I made an effort to get to know Karen better. She was not perfect, but neither was I. We were all just trying to find our way. I still had my own place, and I was happy there. It was small, but it was mine, and it gave me the independence I needed. The community center remained a big part of my life, and the friends I made there became a support system I could rely on. Looking back, I realized that the whole experience had taught me a lot about myself, about family, and about forgiveness. It was not easy, and there were times when I wanted to give up, but I was glad I did not. In the end, it made me stronger, and it brought me closer to the people I cared about. Dad and I still had our differences, but we had learned to communicate better, to listen to each other, and to find common ground. And while Karen would always be a part of our lives, I knew that as long as we were honest and open with each other, we could make it work. Life was not perfect, but it was real, and it was ours. And that was enough.